Thank you. Three, two, one. Good afternoon. This is the Geological Society Business Forum, bringing you Dr. Richard Norris, speaking about energy in society, the myth of utopia. He'll speak for about an hour, after which we will have time for Q&A. If you're on Zoom, please send your questions via the Q&A box, and if you're on YouTube, via the comment box. We have listeners this afternoon from the UK, Europe, and the Americas. Welcome to you all. I'm Mark Steeves. I have sat on the committee of the Geological Society Business Forum and its predecessor, the City of London Geoscience Forum, since inception in 2011. The original intention was to build bridges between the city and the geosciences. As the newly formed and renamed Business Forum, we seek to interface with the broader commercial world in all its manifestations as society at large becomes more aware of the significance of geoscience to the challenges confronting the modern world. Word about me, if I may. I'm non-exec chair of City of London-based investment bank VSA Capital, and I sit on the advisory board of a similar Johannesburg firm called Moshe Capital. Both companies have expertise in natural resources, mining, oil and gas, and so on. Now, although I have always been interested by geology, I am not a geoscientist, but Richard Norris is, and more than just a geologist. He has over 15 years upstream operational oil and gas experience, split between Alpha Aquitaine, Total, BP, Geopetrol, and significantly 16 years in finance with BNP Paribas and Helios. Richard is also a personal investor in energy transition / renewable companies. He holds an MSc in petroleum geology and a PhD in petroleum engineering, both from Imperial College in London. He writes and presents extensively on the relationship between energy, economics, and society. So, Richard, for the second time today, deep breath, take your time, over to you.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon, and thank you all for being here today. I have a lot to get through, so I'm going to jump straight in, and I'm going to try and spend the first 10 minutes or so setting the scene. The myth of utopia, as I refer to it, is a vision of a fairer, more sustainable civilization that is based on cleaner and cheaper energy. In this worldview, we have bucket loads of zero carbon energy, as well as comfortable technological lifestyles, and that not just for the developed world, but for everyone. The world currently faces two problems. One is very high profile, the existential threat of anthropogenic climate change, and the other is the inevitable end of cheap hydrocarbons. Now, many uncertainties exist, but the solution to both these problems is the same: reduce, or better remove, our dependence on hydrocarbons. And as I'm speaking to the Geological Society today, I would just like to illustrate this with reference to our old friends, the dinosaurs. And whilst being very focused, for the sake of argument, on the threat from volcanoes, maybe they just didn't spot the asteroid coming. Now, fossil fuels provide roughly 85% of the world's primary energy. There is a global mandate to transition to low carbon alternatives, yet at the same time, we need to meet the needs of a growing and more aspirational global population. So the challenges we face are those of increasing population, increasing aspiration to affluence, or indeed affluence itself, and a dramatic rise in urbanization. At the same time, we have to transition both the sources of energy and large parts of the legacy infrastructure. So the expectation is that we will be able to carry on our lifestyles, but with clean energy. The alternative view, which is perhaps best personified by Extinction Rebellion, is that we need to rethink the entire system. Now, rethinking the whole system has not got a great track record from a historical point of view. But surprisingly, and especially given that I have spent my career in oil, I believe there is actually some merit in that position, which we will cover towards the end of this talk. Whilst COVID-19 is undoubtedly the most important event of the 21st century so far, I would suggest that prior to COVID, An alternative candidate was the Gilets jaunes movement in France. It is potentially an early warning signal of the way public opinion can change dramatically when even relatively modest trade-offs become manifest. So it is out with the old and in with the new, and this lovely painting is The Fighting Téméraire by Turner, which symbolically marked the end of an era as the last sail-powered man-of-war warship was towed to the breaker's yard by a next-generation steam-powered tug. And so the question that we ask is, can the world run on 100% renewable energy? Because that is essentially what is implied by a net zero world. And the answer is yes, it can, or rather, yes, it has. The only problem being is that this was in about 1700, and the global population was roughly 600 million people. 85% of those people were rural, and life was nasty, brutish, and short. And to give an indication of how short, in 1800, some 50 years after the start of the Industrial Revolution, the average life expectancy in Europe was 34 years. We didn't live in harmony with nature, we died in harmony with nature. And then the real question here is whether the modern world, with 7.8 billion people living in an industrial society, can survive on 100% or close to 100% renewable energy. Now, this cartoon I don't have permission to use, so I apologize, but I use it in almost all my presentations. I think it sums up a lot of situations. We know a lot about step 1, and we know where we want to get to in step 3. It's just that that bit in the middle is difficult. And for us, step 1 is a world powered 85% by fossil fuels, whether we like it or not. And we know where we want to get to in step 3. But it's the bit in the middle that's going to be tricky. But in addition to all of the difficulties I mentioned earlier in terms of the challenge, we also have to note that the world is going through a particularly toxic period of debt. And this is not inconsequential. And whilst it's not the subject of this talk, it is relevant. And we will come on to that when we discuss why energy and the economy are so intimately related. But it is worth remembering that the COVID period has, amongst other things, had a very minor impact on emissions, but has had a very significant impact on the economy and has necessitated a vast increase in global debt. I'm putting the conclusion of this talk here, hopefully to help you as I meander through economics, physics, politics, and finance. I will cover a lot of subjects, and by necessity, I will be shallow and superficial due to the time constraints. So please bear with me and don't be too offended if your favorite subject is a bit mangled in the rush. The conclusion is to maintain our industrial civilization, we will need to be undogmatically open to all energy supply solutions and think hard about how we reconfigure the demand side. In other words, there isn't going to be a single silver bullet solution, and we need to be very open-minded. And in the face of harsher natural conditions, we should aim to be energy rich, not energy poor, because this means we will be more resilient. So managing expectations around the energy transition is important to maintain buy-in. Transitioning our existing energy supply will be a monumental undertaking. In addition, we must factor in a large increase in demand for energy. And public perception is of a transition to the same or maybe a better lifestyle, but only greener and cleaner. And the Gilets jaunes movement is an early warning of what may happen if lifestyles don't get better. And I ask you to keep this question in mind as we progress today. Will energy become cheaper or more expensive in the future? So where are we? Well, we are prosperous, we are urban, and we are powered by fossil fuels. And over the last 200 years, almost every human development index you can think of has improved. The world has improved for humans, although arguably not for many other species. And this is not unsurprisingly coinciding with the Industrial Revolution, which has, of course, been powered by fossil fuels. Now, obviously, it's not just about energy. There's technology, there's medicine, there's diet and sanitation, and so on and so forth. However, cheap and abundant energy has created the society in which all these improvements can happen. So the world is increasingly prosperous, increasingly urban, and powered by fossil fuels. The percentage of fossil fuels has barely shifted despite significant investments in alternatives throughout the whole 30 years since 1990. And what is also noticeable is the total amount of energy used has increased by 50% over those same 3 decades. Now, the alternative view is that the use of fossil fuels means that the world is a terrible place. And you see this in the way statistics are presented in the press. Now, if you just look at that curve of population, it's absolutely terrifying. And you have the Extinction Rebellion with Roger Hallam telling people that billions of people are going to die from starvation. and children who are genuinely scared that whilst we will die of old age, they will die of climate change. But in many ways, the world is actually getting better. And this is amply demonstrated in the book Factfulness by Hans Rosling, which I thoroughly recommend. Obviously, it is a book, and as with any book, it can be criticized. But overall, it presents a compelling argument that not only is the world getting better, but due to a series of cognitive biases and the way that media, activists, and public opinion use and react to those biases, we have a worldview in which we believe that the world is getting worse, when in fact the opposite is true. A good example of this is deaths from climate-related causes. These deaths have dropped by 90% in the last 100 years. Now, that's not a relative change, that's an absolute change. It's gone from nearly 500,000 people a year to about 30,000 people a year. Now, that's still too many, but the absolute drop has occurred as the world's population has risen from 2 billion to 7.5 billion. It is a very remarkable change, and really what's caused it is not a reduction in the number of climate-related events. If anything, it can be argued they're increasing. No, what's happened is that humans are vastly more resilient, and we're more resilient because we have better building standards, we have better materials, we have technology and tech infrastructure, and we have first responders, and we have medical care, and all of which are manifestations of energy-rich, wealthy societies. So what we have at the moment is one of the terms from Hans Rosling's book, is the single focus perspective, where activists or people with a concern focus on one single thing. And when we talk about energy and the energy trilemma, the single focus is all about the environmental impact. We do not discuss energy security or affordability. And I think that is testament to the sheer efficacy and success of the in that we don't worry about energy security. It's always just there on demand. It has become invisible, essentially. Now, we may think that energy is expensive when we pay our bills, but I'm going to show you later on that it is actually ridiculously cheap in terms of what we get for it. So when you see bad news, ask yourself where the good news is. Are you being triggered by your instincts and biases? A good example of this is the graph I showed earlier of world population. This creates fear and a sense of urgency around population growth. But actually, when you take the same data and you present it in a different format on a better scale, it doesn't look anywhere near as scary. And the reason for this is that population growth is not a straight line, it is an S-curve. And we are already very much in the flattening out part of that curve. But even the graph on the right showed the population reaching about 11.5 billion by the end of the century, which is a very big number. But interestingly, a new study published only about 2 weeks ago in The Lancet concludes now that the demographics are changing so fast that population may well stabilize at 8.8 billion by the end of the century. One of the main drivers for this is as populations become wealthier, so birth rates drop dramatically. So when you compare that to the fear-generating graph on the left, you have to ask yourself, are things really as bad as people say they are? Now, being energy rich and consequently wealthy, monetarily wealthy, leads to better stewardship of the environment. This is a study from Yale University on ecosystem vitality and ecosystem health. Equally, being wealthy provides more resilience to natural disasters. You could ask yourself, where would you rather be if you had to be in an earthquake of equal magnitude? So things are not all bad. Avoid the single focus perspective. Whether we like it or not, our starting point is a world powered 85% by hydrocarbons. All human development indexes have improved over the last 150 years. Human well-being has coincided with the Industrial Revolution and an increased energy use. Wealthy nations are more resilient to natural disasters. Wealthy nations are better stewards of the environment. And activists and much media unwittingly or sometimes wittingly exploit cognitive biases. So be curious and open-minded and take no one's word for it, not even mine. And with that in mind, I want to talk now about energy, what it is and why it is not a consumer product, why it's not a commodity, and it's certainly not tobacco. And borrowing the spirit of Monty Python, we can ask, what have hydrocarbons ever done for us? And you see these infographics popping up on social media. And whilst they are inherently true, they're not necessarily a compelling argument because one can always point to alternatives. And more importantly, it just isn't the right way to think about the value of hydrocarbons. The way to think about the value of hydrocarbons is what it contributes to the economy and to society as a cheap source of primary energy. We know about the price of oil, more or less. We know roughly what it costs to produce, but do we have any idea of what it's really worth? Now, obviously, as someone who comes from the oil industry, I'm clearly biased and I'm going to say how wonderful it is. So here goes. 1 barrel of oil has 5.7 million British thermal units, or BTU, of energy. If you had a human working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for 10 years, you would end up with roughly the same amount of work. If you paid that poor sap minimum wage, you would have to pay about $160,000 for the equivalent of 1 barrel's work. Now, the potential of primary energy does not equal work done due to losses, so that number is too high. You do not get work directly from oil. You have to refine it and convert its energy to work by combustion and then mechanics. So you should apply some kind of efficiency factor. Taking maybe a 50% loss, you still end up at $80,000 a barrel, which is clearly at least 3 orders of magnitude above the price of a barrel of oil. So through this lens, you are getting a vast amount of bang for your buck. And this massive energy density gives you and society what are called fossil fuel workers, using Nate Hagen's terminology. Basically, excess energy creates the economy. And so the value of something isn't what someone will pay for it, it is what it contributes. And in this case, we should think of what cheap energy contributes to society. So staying on this theme, the economy is really just surplus energy. If you think of a natural system, the source of primary energy is food. The work that's done is metabolism, respiration, and movement, and so on. And really, unless the net energy is negative, in which case the bear starves, the system is just a fairly neutral cycle. Now, humans have done things a bit differently because we developed tools and we developed farming. And this has allowed groups of people to produce more food than they actually need. And when that happens, it frees up people to do things that are not related to the farming or food gathering. And as a result, they learn crafts and trades. They can make better tools, they can make technology, and this creates a virtuous cycle on the farming and the hunting. And we get technology and technological development. And nowadays you can be, for example, a professional video games player. And this is not a criticism, it's no different from being a professional sportsman or an artist, and people who provide entertainment, which is a social good. It is, however, just an illustration of the distance we have come from everybody working in subsistence farming to having supplemental energy, leveraging human energy so that vast numbers of people are freed up to do other things. So what this means is we're not digging potatoes. Most people don't do this because of industrialization and the abundance of machines doing the work for us. It's now not unusual in developed countries like the United States to have less than 2% of the population working in agriculture, and yet being a net exporter of agricultural products. Mechanization allows huge proportions of population to do things other than produce food. The other thing that it does is it creates more wealth in society. And this can be seen as the amount of disposable income increases or the amount of spending on basic necessities decreases. And one of the things that's very telling about this, for example, the green line on the right-hand graph, which is apparel, 120 years ago, people would spend 10 to 12% of their consumer spending on clothing, and they wouldn't have a great deal. Even going back to my grandfather's generation, having a work suit, a Sunday best, and gardening clothes was about the limit of it. Nowadays, people have to buy storage lockers to put in all their excess clothes and stuff, and that's for a proportion of their income, which is down to just a couple of percent. Similarly, we can note that spending on food and alcohol have decreased dramatically, but volume and choice have increased. We spend less on basic necessities and we have more of everything. Well, the question then is, well, what's that got to do with economics? Now, so far I've been telling you that energy is a fundamental input into the way the economy works. But oddly, energy doesn't get a mention in basic economics. There are 3 variables used in economic theory. You have land, labor, and capital. But whilst land, labor, and capital can be used as a basis for models, it is clear that energy provides huge leverage to labor. It is a very big input into the economy, or even it can be said that it creates the economy. Now, one explanation for the absence of energy in economic theory is that the edifice of modern economics has been built over the last 150 years, and that coincides with the period where almost limitless and cheap energy, accessed through increasing technology, has been the norm. It is an interesting question as to whether any of our modern economic theories will hold if or when energy becomes limited, and that limited nature is manifest through higher costs. Now, it is no surprise that gross domestic product, or GDP, population and energy use are intimately correlated. Correlation is clearly not causation, but we'll talk more about these later. But in the words of Václav Smil, who is a leading academic and author, to discuss energy in the economy is tautology. Energy is the economy. But if energy is the economy, you have to ask the question, what is money? And the answer that some commentators come up with is that money is a claim on energy. And one way of thinking about this is the helicopter drop of money. And again, the image and the concept here have been borrowed from a presentation by Nate Hagens. And you can ask yourself, what will happen? Well, if a helicopter comes along and drops a large amount of money on a given area, people will run outside, collect the money, and everybody will have more money than they had beforehand. Then the question is, what will they do with the money? Well, the answer is they will spend it or they will save it. If they save it in a bank, the bank will lend it and businesses will create products and services. If people spend it, they will be buying products and services. So the net result is that by creating money out of thin air, we are creating more demand for products and services, all of which use energy. Without this money, the goods and services would have been used at some point in the future, but not now. So money crystallizes the use of energy resources, and debt accelerates that process. So in some key points, we are very far from subsistence agriculture. Hydrocarbons are very energy dense. The price of hydrocarbons does not equal their value to society. Energy creates the economy. Money is a call on energy, and debt is an acceleration of that call. And the end fossil fuels now is a great slogan, but it's entirely impractical. Or in summary, energy is the economy. So if energy is the economy, we should be energy agnostic and simply switch out fossil fuels for low carbon alternatives. But in a rather Orwellian way, it's important that we understand that not all energy is equal. Some energy is more equal than others. And the simple answer is that we replace fossil fuels with cleaner and cheaper alternatives. However, as we do this, we need to look at the several related concepts: energy density, which we just spoke about, energy return on energy invested, and even thermodynamics. Now, energy return on energy invested, or EROEI, is rather like the concept of return on capital. In corporate finance or personal investing, you have to invest capital to make a return on capital. And to access energy, we have to use or invest energy. And what we need to do is get out more energy than we put in. What happens over time, of course, is that you find the return on your energy investment decreases because you get the easy stuff early on. And what this means is the denominator increases and the ratio decreases. And this is true for all forms of energy, not just historical oil and gas fields, which had some of the highest returns on energy invested. New oil and gas discovery is less so, and that's because we're having to go to more difficult places, drill deeper wells, go to hostile environments, and so on. And then there's the question of where other energy sources sit. Nuclear, for example, could be in a very different position on this line because the energy density is extremely high. But of course, you need to spend a lot of energy in building the infrastructure necessary to ensure that it is safely managed, so that the net energy here between what you have to put in and what you get out is surprisingly low. But here, what we should note is that there is a shape to this curve, which is described as the cliff edge, and that there is a threshold below which it is suggested that modern industrial society cannot be supported. Now, due to uncertainties on the boundary conditions used in constructing the EROEI concept, these quantified values are very debatable, but I think we should retain two conceptual points. Firstly, the qualitative notion here that there are types of energy which have lower net energy outputs than others. And secondly, there is a threshold, and it is very unclear where that threshold is, in which these low net energy sources will not support the modern industrial society. Now, I've spoken a lot about energy and about the economy, and I haven't really said what energy is. And that's because it's a very difficult concept. A very good description comes from the French thought leader in this area, Jean-Marc Jancovici, and he notes that it is a notion that characterizes the change of state in a system. And I'm not going to read all of these to you, but I think you get the idea by scanning through them. For example, if you move a mass in a gravitational field, you either use energy or it yields energy, and so on. But if we can just recall that energy is used whenever there is transformation of stuff, that will be a help. Again, we don't have time to go into detail today on this subject, but a brief overview of embodied energy is needed. This is a concept that we see more typically in terms of how products have a carbon footprint or embodied carbon. But in the same way, we can think of how much energy has been used to make a product. At every stage of the process, from mineral exploration to mineral extraction to transportation, processing, manufacturing, more transportation, installation, and so on, energy is being used. And embodied energy is the sum of all the energy required to produce any goods or services, considered as if that energy was incorporated or embodied in the product itself. Now, because hydrocarbon energy is, as I say, stupidly cheap, it enables everything to be cheap. And this is a crucial concept as it dictates the direction of travel. By way of examples, the food price index is closely related to oil price. Indeed, I have seen a study which shows how the cost of Campbell's soup is correlated to the oil price. This comment from the BBC, UK inflation drops with oil prices, and of course, prices will increase and inflation will increase if oil prices increase. Now, if we think about renewable energy, if I ask you to spot the renewable energy here, I'll be being deliberately annoying, because one would point to the solar panels and the wind turbines. But the only thing here that is really genuinely renewable is the oil seed, because that is the process of photosynthesis, which is a genuinely renewable process. Renewable energy is a misnomer. We have harvesting machines which actually need building and they need replacing. And when we replace them, we have to use energy to do so. Now, to try and quantify this, I've developed the concept of the weighted average cost of energy. And for those of you who are familiar with corporate finance, you have the weighted average cost of capital, which is the cost of debt times by the percentage of debt, plus the cost of equity times by the percentage of equity, and the combination makes up the capital structure of a company. Now, I've adapted that idea and called it the weighted average cost of energy. And in the current situation, as I showed earlier, primary energy is in the form of fossil fuels. So the cost of the embodied energy in any product is on average 85% times the cost of the fossil fuels, plus the residual 15% multiplied by the cost of the other energy. And that will give you a weighted average cost of energy. And one conclusion here is that even with a fairly rapid increase in renewable energy penetration and a very major compounding decrease in the cost of renewable energy, a small increase in the cost of fossil fuels would disproportionately push the weighted average cost of energy up. Now, as we have seen, that would push up the cost of everything, including soup. But more importantly, the next generation of harvesting machines will get more expensive because of the embodied energy concept. And that would be an iterative process of increasing cost. It's also very hard to talk about energy without talking about thermodynamics. Again, it's potentially a whole separate talk. But most important is the second law of thermodynamics and the concept of entropy. A colloquial version is that as energy is transferred or transformed, more and more of it is wasted. And if you remember from the definition of energy we just saw, every single time we think of goods and services, we are implicitly thinking about transformations of energy. So the more transformations we do, the more energy is lost. According to the second law, energy can be neither created nor destroyed, but it is conserved, albeit in forms that are less and less useful. Thus, entropy increases. So how does that play out? Well, if we think about one of the potential solutions mooted for future energy use, we can imagine a system in which we use current fossil fuels to build renewable energy. Using excess power from wind farms, or indeed building dedicated renewable energy plants, we can create hydrogen because we need to store the energy. That hydrogen is then either used as a direct fuel or more likely converted back into electricity through fuel cells and then pumped back into the grid. And then, because we've gone through a process of electrification and we have banned gas boilers throughout the whole of the UK, we end up with electricity heating our homes or possibly powering our cars. So you can see there have been a lot of transformations and inevitably a lot of losses along the way. So what that implies is that we will need a lot more primary energy to start with for a given amount of end use. And it's very hard to see how that electricity at the end there is going to be cheaper. So a few key points: not all energy is equal. Energy is a change of state in a system. As energy is transformed, more and more of it is wasted. We have the 3 E's: energy density, energy return on energy invested, and embodied or embedded energy. And we have the weighted average cost of energy. With all of that saying that we use energy to get energy. and the net energy needs to be more than just positive to support society. Now, moving on to the energy transition, I have used an image of the Three Gorges Dam here, because when we look at the energy transition to modern renewable energy, the large proportion currently is actually hydropower. And what we see are graphs of exponential increases, and we get dramatic predictions. We get gurus who predict things like clean tech will wipe fossil fuels off the market in about a decade. And he harks back to things such as Moore's law, to the way in which digital photography disrupted Kodak, the way that cars disrupted the horse and cart. And I would say he has probably the best job in the world. He goes around the world telling people exactly what they want to hear, and they pay him a lot of money for the privilege. I do wonder whether I shouldn't do that rather than this, but anyway, here I am today. Now, these slides are a bit dated, and the endpoints will be higher today because renewable energy is progressing fast, but the illustration is still useful. What we start with is a very steep increase in the terawatt hours being produced by solar and wind. Now, that's normal. You're starting from a very low base. Of course, the rate will increase. Sorry, of course, the rate of increase will be high. But as we move from electricity to primary energy, and then we put it on a correct scale, and maybe we just remove the hydro part so we can see what's really happening, we start to see that even when this is updated to 2020 data, we're very far from any meaningful transition. So what is the energy transition? Well, one of the things you can note is that there never has really been an energy transition. There's just been additions of energy. Locally, yes, there have been transitions, but globally, no, not really. And what we can note from this graph is that the historical transitions have gone from low density sources to high energy density sources. However, the next step is going to be reversing that trend, and we're going to be more reliant on less energy dense sources of power. And so that brings us to the cost of renewable energy. And this is a concept that's often referred to as being deflationary. The price of solar panels has come down dramatically, and as has the sale price for electricity generated from wind. And what you will read in the newspapers is that renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil fuels. And the problem is that it actually isn't. And the reasons for that are well known. The first one is that the cost of re-engineering a system to go from centralized to decentralized generation. This is a bit of a straw man argument, as it is a one-off cost, so it should be manageable if we do it right. The second thing is, of course, intermittency. You need to provide security of supply, and always on 100% reliable power has a different metric to simply cherry-picked examples, which may well be real, but not necessarily meaningfully comparable. For example, Norway has 86% hydropower. The UK never will have. It's an accident of geography, or maybe I should say geology. The key thing I want to say about this slide is that the actual cost of electricity to the user is really the only benchmark that matters. It doesn't matter how cheap solar panels are. The cost to the user of having 100% reliable electricity when they need it is the key. So here's another example. The results are clear. Wind farms are not cost effective when a certain output must be guaranteed. And this statement highlights the energy trilemma, the part about the value of security of supply. To be clear, it doesn't come from some big oil-sponsored lobby group, but comes from the International Journal of Sustainable Energy and was published about 2 months ago. The levelized cost of energy referred to is a useful concept, such that if you take into account all of the factors, how much does it cost to get energy to the electricity to the end user? Unfortunately, the LCOE has issues in the same way that the energy return on energy invested does, in that it is not an exact science. It requires that you set boundary conditions for the calculation, needing choices about what is included and what isn't, and is thus open to biases and manipulation. As per energy return on energy invested, though, it is a useful tool, but precise numbers coming out should not necessarily be viewed as accurate. So just to give an example of energy security and why this is important, back in January, I noticed that there were a few days where the wind turbines locally were not turning. And what happens in the UK is you get high pressure systems, anticyclones sitting over the country. In summer, these produce nice, warm, sunny weather. In winter, they produce cold, generally windless conditions, which are very often associated with grey skies and fog. Now in orange here, you have the wind generation, and in blue, the gas-powered gigawatts. So for the first period from about the 12th to the 19th of January, it was pretty windy, and this was generating between 10 and 13 gigawatts of electricity. But as the anticyclone settled in, that dropped to a low of about 1 gigawatt, and on average was about 2 to 5 gigawatts over a period of 6 days. The missing wind, or rather the gap between the straight orange line and the actual capacity line, the orange wiggly line, was on average about 8 gigawatts every hour for about 170 hours. So in 2019, the United Kingdom had 700 megawatts of utility scale battery capacity, which sounds like a lot, but when they're required to deliver power, batteries discharge in about an hour. So the entire capacity of the UK could supply about 10% of the missing supply for 1 hour, or the equivalent of 6 minutes of load, whereas you have a gap of 10,000 minutes. The implication is you would need 1,600 times the current utility battery capacity to bridge just a small 6-day winter calm period. But then if you take the logic a little bit further and think about 40-year events, and we've had these, we had a beautiful summer in 1976 and another one in 2018. The last time this happened in winter badly was in 1963. And there was a period of 60 days just before Christmas to the beginning of March in which the average nighttime temperature was below zero. Only briefly did it get up to above zero at any point. This period was also characterized by having very calm conditions. So by simple arithmetic, you would need 16,000 times the current battery capacity to bridge the gap of 60 days of much colder weather. And that if you are only missing 8 megawatts. But don't forget that the plan is to use much more electricity as we remove gas from heating and increase electrical vehicle usage. If you factor in increased absolute electricity demand and increased penetration of renewables, the numbers will literally go off the scale. And understanding the scale of the problem gives the lie to the very superficial media reporting that the things such as backup battery capacity is increasing. Yes, it is, but it is nowhere near the scale that's needed. So let's talk about scale and continue talking about it here in the carbon neutral society that we want to achieve by 2050. Here we see an example in which fossil fuels in black decline to zero by 2050, and there is a dramatic increase in low carbon alternatives, needing a radical change in slope. However, as incongruous as this is, it is actually wrong. To phase out fossil fuels and not have blackouts, the slope of the increase of alternatives should look like that. Otherwise, you have a massive hole in your energy supply budget. Now, Roger Pelkey from the University of Colorado, Professor Roger Pelkey, I should say, has a useful thought experiment on this. He notes that the world is using 11,800 million tons of oil equivalent per year. If we were to reduce that to zero, we would need to reduce the 1 million tons of oil equivalent every day for the next 30 years, because by happy coincidence, there are about 11,000 days between now and 2050. So what does 1 million tons of oil equivalent look like as a low carbon alternative? Well, that's roughly one mid-sized nuclear plant or 1,500 2.5 megawatt wind turbines. And you'd need to install that every day for the next 30 years. So again, we're barely scratching the surface of this. Very briefly, and again, a whole separate subject, but the schadenfreude that exists towards the lack of value attributed to hydrocarbons and its producing companies belies a fundamental lack of understanding. Data does not power the economy. Car manufacturers do not power the economy. If the energy gets more expensive, these businesses will simply have fewer customers. Now, this is a case study about the Netherlands recently published in the Harvard Business Review that looks at the profitability or not of emission reduction projects. And the short version is that A, most are unsurprisingly unprofitable and will require carbon taxes or subsidies. B, many require technology that is not yet available at scale or may just displace the emissions, notably the blue, which is biomass and carbon capture. And thirdly, the law of diminishing returns, which means that incremental gains, as you approach 100%, will get progressively more expensive. And this will have implications for public support later in the process. I think it's interesting to note that the fairly anti-nuclear Dutch have a big chunk of nuclear as a possible solution, which is shown in green. Perhaps the exhaustion of their giant Groningen gas field may have provoked a change of heart here. So let's keep in mind, it's always about the scale, and the scale leads to the cost of the transition. Energy transition is barely started, despite graphs and gurus. Historically, we have seen additions, not transitions. Moving from high energy density to low energy density sources will be a first in human history. Global carbon neutral by 2050 looks to be impossible. Data does not power the economy. Most emissions reductions will not be profitable. And there is a law of diminishing returns with respect to public opinion as we get past the low-hanging fruit. Now, moving on to energy politics, and given the scale of the issues I've just described and the relationship of energy to macroeconomics, it's not surprising that any discussion about economics is essentially political at some level. Firstly, I'd like to talk about energy poverty. We tend to think about energy poverty being in developing nations, and this is indeed an area of focus. But in the same incongruous way that energy doesn't feature in basic economics, you also won't find it in the Charter of Human Rights, while things like access to Wi-Fi are being mooted as possible additions. To be fair, in 2015, the UN did add it to its list of sustainable development goals, which is good because almost all of the other goals won't be addressed without it. Energy poverty is also a feature of developed countries. The map shows excess deaths in winter in Europe, and whilst not the only cause of energy poverty and the inability to pay for heating bills is actually a major contributing factor. Energy justice is also a complex subject. Energy injustice exists not only between countries at different stages of development, but also within countries. The graphs are different representations of how this plays out in the UK and Northern Ireland. Focusing on the top left, we can see a graph of energy costs expressed as a percentage of household expenditure. The upper line is the poorest 10% of the population. For them, energy costs range between 6% and 12% of household expenditure. For the richest 10%, which is the green line at the bottom, the cost varies between 2 and 3%. So clearly, poorer people are disproportionately affected by variations in the cost of energy. Then if we think about how well-intentioned incentive schemes work, we can find some surprising conclusions. Even with subsidies, equipping a residence with solar panels needs two things. It needs ownership of the property and upfront capital. So clearly this will exclude segments of society. In addition, the incentive is until recently guaranteed through feed-in tariffs. So the middle classes who install solar panels benefit from low electricity bills, whereas cost is borne by everyone. There is thus a transfer of wealth from poorer to wealthier sections of society. And you can think of subsidies for electric vehicles in the same way. And this is far from the ideal of increasing social equality. Now, in terms of powering development, political decisions in donor or funding countries can have perverse effects. For example, it seems very obvious that there are enormous benefits to replacing the use of traditional biomass, not just for the environment, but also for health. Indoor air pollution kills about 2 million people every year and creates untold damage to health of many others. The alternative can often be gas, but a dogmatic opposition to gas can range from the drilling of gas wells right through to the use of it in cooking. A bit of good news is that in one case, the affordability of clean cooking gas in East Africa is being improved by the judicious use of tradable carbon credits from Asia. Now, energy access makes for great photos of solar panels and light bulbs being used for homework, but there is considerable evidence that energy access doesn't solve energy poverty. For that, you need grid-scale resources and the overall lifting of the economy to really have meaningful impact. And it's no coincidence that sub-Saharan Africa has the lowest rates of access to electricity and also the lowest rates of carbon emissions. On a per capita basis, Nigeria, for instance, would be just a pinprick. With 1.5 to 3 billion people without access to reliable electricity, it seems unjustified to deny people the opportunity to develop. If we think of, for example, Tanzania or in Zimbabwe, if they were to use coal, it would make no meaningful difference to the global carbon budget, but would make a huge difference to the populations of these countries. But funding for coal is now essentially cut off. And indeed, if we don't want to do coal, should we consider nuclear perhaps? Another refrain we hear is that it just needs the political will. And this comes with the assumption that the technology exists. Oddly, we also see a constant stream of press articles on the latest silver bullet technology, which clearly would be a non-story if the technology actually existed. Now, political will is strong at the moment, blown along by huge public opinion tailwinds. As the transition becomes more expensive with less visible incremental improvements, it is a question as to how resilient the political will be. As an example, this year, Germany will have to pay 28 billion euros to indemnify renewable energy firms for not producing energy when there is a mismatch between demand and oversupply at certain times. This is such a big number that it was deemed expedient to transfer part of the cost into general taxation as a form of stealth tax. As they say, you can fool all of the people some of the time. And subsidies are another political brick. There was a now infamous IMF study that claimed the fossil fuels received the astronomical figure of $5.2 trillion in subsidies. Now, this made fantastic headlines, but was mostly an amalgam of attempts to price in every externality and every possible hardship that could even loosely be attributed. The question of externalities is a very valid one, but it is also vastly complex. However, when we hear the word subsidies, we should really be thinking about direct cash grants of some kind. And I just mentioned the 28 billion euros hole this has created for the German population. With respect to the IMF study, buried in the 5.2 trillion figure was the still big number of about 400 billion, which was mostly related to direct subsidies of petrol or gasoline to consumers. Now, these do indeed exist, and obviously lower prices at the pump will encourage use when it is something that should be discouraged. Now, in the UK, the price of £1.15 a litre is made up of roughly 70 to 75 pence of tax and VAT. So the tax-free price would be about 50 US cents a litre. So I looked at the data and assumed that countries where gasoline is more than 50 cents are receiving taxes, and those with less than 50 cents are paying subsidies. And I looked at this on a simple ranking, and here it is presented as a volume-weighted ranking to see the real global impact. And as you can see, the subsidized gasoline represents only about 5% of global gasoline sales. And that is in countries which are dominantly producers of oil or are poor. So it's hardly a global scandal. All of these themes come together in the idea that we may have reached peak prosperity. Sorry, we're not advancing here. At some point in the last couple of decades. Household income has been decreasing, as has purchasing power. Now, I would pinpoint that as happening from 1998 onwards. But whatever the timing, when key sections of society are marginalized and unfairly treated, we get social unrest, and the French term of purchasing power is pouvoir d'achat. And I was living in France in 2018 and heard it a lot as the Yellow Vest movement was in full swing. Another telling quote was, "We are not worried about the end of the century, we are worried about them making it to the end of the month." And also, why should we pay more for essential fuel so some rich guy in Paris can have a subsidized Tesla? So key takeaways here, energy poverty is not just in developing countries. Energy justice is far more complex than it appears. Ideology, dogma, and political leanings can create biased solutions. Global problems, but there are local realities that need to be addressed. And we must manage people's expectations to avoid a backlash. You'll be pleased to know we're getting through this presentation. It's part 6. Are we rushing off a cliff? And in this section, I'm going to talk specifically about oil because it is a driver of the world economy. But the same thoughts apply more broadly to hydrocarbons in general. There is an expression from the 1970s. When we think about energy, we have only 2 modes, complacency and panic. And despite all the complexities, oil price tends to reflect these 2 sentiments. When we are complacent, nothing really moves the price of oil. I think we've got to a point now where we're beyond complacent. There is now disdain for oil. It underpins virtually everything we do, and yet there's a feeling that we don't like it, we don't need it, and we certainly don't want it. It should just be left in the ground. And one of the manifestations of this complacency and disdain was that in 2019, when there were some very serious geopolitical tensions bordering on war in the main oil-producing area of the Gulf, a series of events which would have in normal times pushed the oil price through the roof barely had any impact at all. And the reason for that is what I call the bookend problem. On one hand, there is a perception that we have more oil than we will ever need. And on the other hand, peak demand is just around the corner. Within 10 years, we're all going to be driving electric cars. So the only problem about supply of oil is really a problem for the oil companies who will have stranded assets. Now, there are multiple future demand scenarios trying to capture a world that requires more energy, but is transitioning away from hydrocarbons. Of these scenarios, I'm focusing on the rapid transition scenario, which is in orange and is the lower of the top group of lines. In this scenario, oil demand drops to about 80 million barrels a day by 2040. It's important to note that this rapid transition scenario has a faster transition than that of stated policy scenario. These were the policies which were moral but not necessarily legal commitments that countries made in the Paris Climate Agreement. So the rapid transition scenario is better than if countries conform to all their promises. Well, what does the rapid transition really mean for oil? Yes, it looks like peak demand is here, and indeed in a post-COVID world, peak demand may well have been at the end of 2019. But for engineers in the room, when you look at a curve like that, you should be thinking about the area under the graph, because that is the volume of oil that we produce. So we may have seen peak demand, but peak demand does not mean demand stops. It does not mean a cliff edge. And what that looks like in terms of future volumes is really quite shocking. In the entire 150 years of the hydrocarbon industry, we have produced and used roughly 1.5 trillion barrels of oil. And quite staggeringly, roughly half of those 1.5 trillion barrels has been produced and used in just the last 20 years. And that's the middle blue wedge here. And it's very sobering to see that in the rapid transition scenario in orange, we will need the same amount of oil again in the next 20 years. In other words, an additional 700 billion barrels will be needed in the next 2 decades. Now, some of that oil, roughly 300 to 350 billion barrels, will come from existing producing oil fields. Some more of it will come from known projects, although a lot of those projects are not being sanctioned at the moment. And a very large chunk, 300 to 350 billion barrels, has got to come from resources that are either not being exploited yet or have not even been discovered. And that's just the next 20 years. And when we look at the supply side, these graphs are slightly out of date, but the point still holds. The 3 main producing countries in the world, Saudi Arabia, Russia, illustrated here, and the United States, between them produce well over a third of the world's oil. And they are all producing at or around their historical highs. In the case of Saudi Arabia and Russia, almost all of that oil comes from very large, old, mature and super mature fields, which were discovered in the middle of the last century. Production in the United States was in steep decline until they started extracting oil from shale, and I will talk more about that subsequently. But if we think about countries who have in the past produced a lot more oil, there are 1 or 2 that we can mention, such as the United Kingdom and Norway, where it is pretty clear that geologically it is very unlikely they will produce significant amounts of oil, conventional oil, ever again. We also have countries which have the potential to produce known reserves, but are not doing so for geopolitical reasons. These are notably Libya, Venezuela and Iran. So if you believe the main producers are already, shall we say, maxed out, and that historical overproducers are not going to be able to step up, then it is very worrying if the world's future oil supply, and by proxy the world economy, is in the hands of Iran, Venezuela and Libya. So we hear a lot of talk about stranded assets, about having more oil than we need. But in many ways, the supply side, particularly of conventional oil, is actually very fragile. And you will probably say, well, Richard, we've heard all this before. This is a form of déjà vu. You're just talking about peak oil. And peak oil is an old story, and it never came to pass. Now, I think most members of the Geological Society will agree that we are nowhere near peak oil. Now, there are vast resources out there. But the key point here is the ones that are remaining are going to be hard to get. And they're almost certainly going to be expensive. So it is extremely likely that we have passed peak cheap oil. And with it, there is the notion I mentioned earlier that as a society, we may have passed peak prosperity. Future oil demand will be met, but we need to look at the different sources of oil and what we will be relying on in the near future. It is quite sobering to note that sometime between 2005 and 2011, the production of conventional oil peaked. And in this analysis by Art Berman, he separates out deep water production and oil sands as well as tight oil from conventional, because he argues, and I think quite rightly, that it's not just the light tight oil or the shale in the US that's unconventional. Because of the technology and cost, deep water drilling is also a form of unconventional. And a slide, again borrowed from Nate Hagen's presentation in the top right here, shows we start with the low-hanging fruit but end up with the hard stuff. If shale was a party, it has been described as a retirement party. It might be worth noting that as wind farms move offshore because of environmental pressures onshore, they're also moving into a higher cost environment, just like oil did several decades ago. So when we look at where the future supply is going to come from, which is the graph on the bottom right, we have the sort of beige gray part here, which is the currently producing fields, which will decline naturally. We have a green tranche, which will come from sources with current approvals that we know about. And we have an assumption that within 5 years, the US would need to be producing 17 million barrels a day from just the shale resources. Well, shale production peaked in the autumn of 2019 at about 9.5 million barrels a day and is now declining fast. It was declining pre-COVID because companies were not making money. The COVID oil price crash is accelerating this decline, and for various structural reasons, it is extremely unlikely to pick up rapidly, and it will only do so with much higher oil prices. Now, there's way too much on this graph, I apologize, but it's an extract from an article I wrote recently. But the key point is that the price of oil depends on the cost of extracting what's called the marginal barrel. Whether you're producing 80 million barrels a day or 100, the price really is determined by, in normal conditions, by only about 1 or 2 million barrels a day, which is the mismatch between supply and demand over a very short or short to medium period. What has happened over the last 10 years is that in the US, shale companies have attracted huge amounts of cheap capital caused by quantitative easing, both debt and equity, and they have produced a lot of oil. But they've acted like tech companies, aiming for growth over value, and they have consistently lost money. For every barrel of oil that was produced in the US and sold at $40, $50, or $60, money was being lost by investors. And ironically, this is a form of subsidy, one that is entirely unintentional. Investors didn't go into this seeking to lose money, but it is what happened. And you can see this from Chesapeake here on the right, and from an analysis of the sector by Bloomberg on the left. It's a market distortion. By subsidizing or artificially depressing the market, the price of the marginal barrel has been detached from the reality of the cost of producing those barrels. And in consequence, the price of all barrels of oil everywhere have been artificially low for several years. Now, when oil went negative, albeit briefly earlier this year, it was more of a financial market issue than physical. But what this has done is it has accelerated a trend that was occurring since the oil price crash of 2014. All companies are cutting their capital investments, but they are being cut enormously in oil and gas. And if you think back to what I was saying about the potential supply gap, cutting investment now in a long cycle business is probably not a great way to prepare for a future supply gap. The real price of the marginal barrel is also affected by what's called the break-even price. This is not the break-even price of how much it costs to produce a barrel from an existing field, or how much it costs to develop a new field. This is the break-even price for many of the large producing countries, particularly in the Middle East and West Africa, where their national budgets depend upon income from oil and gas revenues. And you may say, well, we don't really care what their budget is. I mean, that's their problem, isn't it? And well, no, it's not just their problem. If we take Iraq as an example, when oil is selling at $40 a barrel and they need $100 a barrel to balance the state budget, there is really only one solution. Borrowing on international markets is not a possibility, so they have to spend less. And when a state spends less, it spends less on things like salaries and infrastructure. It will spend less, ironically, on its main industries, even the oil producing industry. So you have a toxic mix, a lack of spending on infrastructure as well as social instability. And you get the latter because people are not being paid. Now, if you don't pay teachers, that may put people out of school. But if you don't pay the army and the police, and then electricity fails and food starts to become scarce, you will likely have serious instability. In all these cases, oil production will decline. Thus, the fiscal break-even for these countries is important, and it will act as a balancing mechanism on the price of oil. The saying has it, low oil prices are the cure for low oil prices. So the future supply for the next 5 to 6 years, as I mentioned, we will have what I call a triple whammy. There's a multi-year underinvestment in conventional oil products. We have a fairly rapid collapse in US shale and not much perspective of it being refinanced. And we have unsustainable production at low oil prices from a lot of the main producing countries. So what we've seen already is a very rapid rebalancing in the price of oil. The brief blip earlier in this year has gone away. Oil is at about $40 a barrel. And even with the uncertainties around demand destruction by an ongoing COVID pandemic, the price, $40 a barrel, is manageable, but it won't trigger investment. So I think that leaves us sort of something of a crossroads. We have a society in which we have energy which is plentiful and cheap, but polluting and potentially causing existential climate issues. We would like to go to a society in which energy is cheap and clean. But by everything I've looked at and studied, this seems like it is indeed a myth of utopia. What we're very likely to end up with is a lot more cleaner energy, but it's going to be more expensive. And there are social implications to that. And then there is a worst case scenario, which is what I call the Mad Max scenario, in which before we manage to roll out enough renewable energy to help power our 8 billion people and start cleaning the environment, we start to run out of the cheap hydrocarbons. And if we end up with the same polluting but now expensive energy sources, then we will be in a situation where the world will be poorer and thus less resilient. And we may well have to face increasingly bad climatic issues whilst being poorer. Now, to push this point even further, we may actually be making this Mad Max scenario both more probable and more imminent. I mentioned the triple whammy facing oil supply. There's actually an additional feature, or a quadruple whammy, because the world of finance, driven by public opinion, has an enormous movement to divest from fossil fuels. Now, it's very easy to protest, and it's very easy to say we don't want fossil fuels. And it gives a lot of status to politicians and asset managers to make grand statements about divesting. But on the other hand, people who are very knowledgeable about the supply side are worried, not for their own personal gain. And I think we should be very clear about that. They are saying that the industry needs many trillions of dollars because we're going to have a fairly catastrophic supply gap if we don't, simply because we're not going to move away from fossil fuels as fast as people want or expect. And when you divest from fossil fuels, you are unintentionally, or in some cases intentionally, increasing the cost of capital for the people who produce the very energy that powers the world. And again, a lot of people may say, well, good, that's a good thing. It will put them out of business. And yes, it may well. But when the companies go out of business, demand does not stop. There are fewer people producing the resources, and scarcity will occur and will push prices up again. So the divestment process may well work in putting a lot of firms out of business, but it may well have economic and societal impact that is far more negative than we actually anticipate. And if we think about carbon taxes, they will have the same effect. If we go back to my idea of the weighted average cost of energy, I'd like to point out something that's pretty obvious, but if you put a carbon tax on 85% of the energy which goes into the manufacturing of absolutely everything, including renewable energy, you're going to push up the cost of everything, including that renewable energy. A carbon tax is, of course, a tax. Now, carbon taxes are designed to drive behavior, to encourage people to move away from something. But in doing so, there is going to be unintended consequences. We will make the basic machines we need for renewable energy and everything else, including soup, more expensive. And expensive energy is bad news. Now, the reason it's bad news is that it triggers recessions. And this is a graph from the Financial Times, and it's a fascinating graph. It doesn't show the oil price. It shows oil consumption as a percentage of gross domestic product. So when the world has to spend more than 5% of global GDP on oil, it triggers recessions. And this is, again, the notion of the bang for your buck, or the energy return on energy invested. You're deploying capital, which is a function of the energy you had in the past, to get the energy you need in the future. Now, I'm concerned with, talking about whether we will have enough energy in the next 5 to 10 years. If you start to look out 20 years, the kind of graphics you get are like this. Now, this is the correlation I showed earlier between population, GDP, and energy demand. And what is noticeable about this? Well, on the one hand, you have business as usual growth in population, and more importantly, growth in affluence. And on the other, you no longer have the same lockstep increase in energy usage. There is an enormous decoupling, starting from about 600 quadrillion British thermal units of energy used in the world globally today. This is expected to increase to and plateau at about 700 quadrillion by 2040. However, if the historical correlation continues, we would be at nearly 1,300 quadrillion, which is nearly twice as much. And this is an unimaginable amount of energy. But what is likely to happen here is that the population is going to increase in the way that we understand it. The relationship between population and energy is probably going to increase rather along the lines of the historical correlation as people seek greater affluence, and we're not going to see this huge decoupling. So when we think of population and energy as inputs to the equation, we can see that GDP could be an output. If that is the case, then we have to evoke enormous energy savings, which are a rather facile explanation for a gigantic and unprecedented decoupling. If this decoupling does not occur at this scale, then we will be energy constrained and GDP will be a lot lower, or in other words, global society will be a lot poorer. Energy efficiency is a whole separate topic, but it is also not simple. Now, there are good examples where energy efficiency certainly does have an effect on the demand side. In the UK, the transition from filament light bulbs to low energy light bulbs has had a quantifiable effect on energy demand. And in fact, energy demand is actually decreasing slightly in most OECD countries. It's just that on a global scale, it's being swamped by the increase in developing nations. However, very often, energy efficiency is paradoxically not a solution. It generally comes with a reduction in the unit price of things. Here are examples of the cost of data and of air travel. And as the price comes down, consumers use more. And actually, the amount they use more than offsets the gains from the energy efficiency. And this is called Jevons paradox, and it's been widely demonstrated. Essentially, what you do when you create energy efficiency is you displace the energy usage. If you think what would happen if you switch all of the lights to high efficiency, low energy bulbs, the individual or the business will save money. That money, as I described earlier, will be used. It will either be put in a bank or it will be used to buy goods and services. Either way, it will then engender the use of energy. So you are at best displacing energy through energy savings. Unless, and this is a very important caveat, if the energy saving device is overall more expensive than the thing it's replacing. But then you might see the issue implicit in that logic. If it's more expensive, people will feel poorer if the same thing costs more. So the key points, recent oil prices are not representative of oil. Oil should have been much more expensive for the last 10 years. Peak oil is not the end of oil, and it's definitely not a cliff edge. 50% of the total historical production has happened in just the last 20 years, and we're going to need to repeat that in the next 20 years, even under a rapid transition scenario. Most of that new oil will be unconventional oil, and unconventional oil is expensive oil. The end of cheap oil may well be past, and with it peak prosperity. And to my mind, this is a clear and present danger. So finally, part 7, how do we bridge to the future? Well, I returned to the energy trilemma, which I presented earlier, and I showed that there was a single focus on the environmental impact, particularly of hydrocarbons. Now, simply swapping out hydrocarbons for low carbon alternatives is fraught with trade-offs and difficulties. But are we going to be able to supply energy reliably so that we have food and electricity, so that we have fuel for transport? And is that energy going to be affordable? We need to have an objective analysis of the trade-offs and avoid dogmatic positions. You can see the kind of difficulties that this entails just by observing the schism in the environmental movement on nuclear energy currently. The reality is that in starting from where we are today, which is something that we can't change the starting point, we're going to need more of everything when it comes to energy. And yet, with environmental concerns, affordability and security, you cannot optimize for all of them. So we must consider everything on its merits and avoid ideological points of view. Oil and gas will be needed in large volumes for at least the next 2 decades and probably more. Solar and wind should be maximized, particularly where cost effective and with a view to reducing the use of fossil fuels as fast as possible. Carbon capture utilization and storage should be researched and massively scaled. In the environmental community, it is often considered a moral hazard because it will allow the continued use of fossil fuels. That may or may not be true, but it is a very important piece of the puzzle in terms of reducing carbon emissions. Hydrogen, geothermal, batteries, pump storage will all have a role, but I think none of them are silver bullets or game changers. Nuclear fission should be repositioned as a mainstay of low carbon energy. It's quite incredible in France, which has 73% of its electricity coming from nuclear. A recent poll showed that the majority of people didn't think of nuclear as being low carbon, yet it is hard to imagine any seriously low carbon future that doesn't have a lot of nuclear power. Nuclear fusion, it could be the game changer that fission was supposed to be, but then again, we've been waiting for it a long time. Still, research should most definitely continue. Hydropower has an important role, but has geographical limitations and environmental issues and is unlikely to figure outside of a few key locations in the future. Coal may even have a limited role in certain countries on a cost basis, and I think particularly of poorer countries. The use of traditional biomass should be replaced by gas. We should not be dogmatically opposed to gas simply because it is a fossil fuel. However, the one thing I think we probably should have less of is modern biomass. I think it's very much a case of smoke and mirrors, and I don't believe that it is either carbon neutral or beneficial in any sense. Now, I have talked extensively about the supply of energy. However, we will need to use it in the future, and how we will need to use it in the future is a very interesting question. we need to focus far more on the demand side. And this isn't just about demand side response or a little bit of balancing here and a little bit of everybody doing their bit. This is structurally reconfiguring modern societies so that we can have an acceptable level of lifestyle and yet use far less energy. And this is now becoming an area of study, although it is still relatively niche and new. And this can be found under terminology such as shift projects or transition engineering. And transition engineering is starting to be studied in a few places, but I know of it through the work of Professor Susan Krumdiek, and I hope I pronounce her name correctly, who's from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. And to quote, the transition engineering aims to take advantage of the current access to the remaining low cost and higher EROEI energy resources, by that we mean hydrocarbons, to redevelop all aspects of urban and industrial engineered systems such that we can adapt as fossil fuel use is dramatically reduced. In other words, how can we engineer decent, but probably more simple and frugal lifestyles based on significantly lower per capita energy use? So what we really had ahead of us is that instead of the greener, cleaner and cheaper utopia, where everybody is wealthy and green, we are entering the post-carbon era. This seems inevitable, so it largely doesn't matter what the driver of this is, whether it is because of existential climate change risk or because simply we're running out of cheap oil and gas. This is happening. And again, from Nate Hagens, if this is the carbon pulse, you are here. And the question is, where do we go from here? Well, if you have transition engineering and it is successful, we can possibly manage the next 20 years. We could have what we would call managed decline. And I've illustrated this with a wonderful book, Cider with Rosie by Laurie Lee, which describes life in a small village in the UK between the First and Second World War. And what is really striking about this book is the enormous gulf there is between the lifestyle that is described in the book and the lifestyle that you would find in the same village in the UK today. Now, managed decline may well mean that we will be going back to something closer to what life was like 100 years ago. Your world will get a whole lot smaller, there will be less travel, there will be less international movement of goods, less globalization, and so on and so forth. Well, the alternative, and it's actually quite worrying, this is the Mad Max scenario, and it's surprisingly well described in the final chapters of a book called The Bone Clocks. This is where we don't manage things properly. We don't have clean energy going forward. We don't have a sustainable lifestyle. We have a chaotic economic and social collapse. If you believe even half of what I've said today, it's hard to see scenarios which are not one of these two. And I think the only scenario which people cling to in an almost religious way these days is that somehow technology will save us. And to a large extent, every Malthusian description of the end of the world has always been proven wrong by technological advances. So there is a good chance that everything I said today is wrong and that technology will save us. But as Art Berman has said, Americans have more faith in technology that hasn't been invented yet than they do in God. And the problem is that technology can find ways of harnessing energy, but it can't create new energy, with perhaps the exception of nuclear fusion. Now, if decline is what is in store for us, whether it is managed or chaotic, how best to manage the decline? Well, we need to reduce the use of hydrocarbons, ironically, so that we actually extend the duration over which they play a role in the economy. We will require more of almost every form of energy, and for a rational debate about that, we need to avoid ideology and dogma. We need to focus on energy demand, how we correctly do the transition engineering, and we need to avoid chaotic collapse. So I invite you to stay very optimistic. Humans have always managed to do it so far. Hopefully we will do it again. Now, I've tried to highlight where I have used other people's work throughout this presentation, but I recognize I haven't done it rigorously. There's a lot of people who spend time thinking and writing about these issues and on whose work I have heavily borrowed. You will be able to see this slide in the recording, but there's a more complete and updated bibliography on my website, which you're welcome to look at. So with that, I will take a deep breath, apologize for overrunning. Thank you all very much for your attention. I hope some of you are still out there, and I'll hand back to Mark for the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for that. You didn't run over very much more than last time. Let me see, 74 minutes, which is, yeah, it is. It's 4 minutes more than this morning. We've got a few questions. I'm going to go through them as they came in, if I can. First of all, I had some from a couple of things from Lucy Williams, but before her, Nigel Quinton asked the question, what is your source for the calculations of return on retained earnings, RORE, for renewables?
Sorry, the energy return on energy invested.
RORE, he said, return on retained earnings for renewables.
I don't think I presented anything on return on earnings from renewables, but the two sources I used for the energy return on energy invested, which is also called EROEI, actually, I don't remember where I got those graphs from, and I apologize. But I think the point I wanted to make about those graphs was that I don't take them quantitatively. I think of them as a qualitative concept that gives you a general understanding of the way things work. In the second graph, I didn't dwell on it, but one of the examples was that which actually was in monetary terms, maybe what you're referring to. The second graph showed how wind and solar are economic. There's an economic threshold in that graph until you combine them with storage. And of course, you do need storage if you want to make them useful to society. And it showed that the economic return was not was below the economic threshold in that analysis. And again, I don't wish to dwell on the quantitative or quantified aspects of that, just to show that there is a notion of net energy. This is probably the most important point there.
Good. The second question I have, well, first of all, Lucy Williams, she was going to ask us something about battery storage, and then decided that in fact you dealt with the question during the course of the talk. But then she subsequently has come up with another question. She says, Richard, if what you say is true, what motivates / drives government to set net zero targets?
That's a good question. I think the answer is short-term politics, is that if public opinion is very, very focused on the environmental impact, and that there is a perception, and we saw this in the Democratic primaries, where candidates were essentially trying to outbid each other on how quickly they were going to change the system and how soon that the climate apocalypse would be on us. And you know, and the objective is to go in the direction of public opinion and either get elected or stay elected. So I think there's an element of politics. I think people also recognize that we genuinely have to make these changes. So I think there's a combination of the two. Obviously, there are a lot of unelected people in things like UN bodies who also drive the agenda. And that's done through you know, what they would call following the science, and I think that's right. So we, you know, it's probably a different answer for different groups of people, but to a large extent, I think it's public opinion.
Thank you, Richard. I have a question from Mike Simmons. I think you've largely dealt with this, but I know that it's a subject you can talk a little bit more about. He asks about carbon capture and storage, which he says doesn't greatly figure in your thinking. Would you like to comment further?
Yes, and as I apologized in the talk, you know, almost any one of these sections of the talk could be a standalone hour-long talk on its own, so it was impossible to cover all of these. I think carbon capture and storage is very interesting, and I think there are two kinds. There's the kind which is bolted onto power stations and industrial units where a lot of carbon is emitted. I think we're going to see a lot more research into that, because again, we're not going to change the infrastructure overnight. So if there is a good way of taking the carbon out, that is the place to do it. The other form is called direct air capture. And the problem with that is that carbon dioxide is in very, very small, you know, sort of parts per million in the atmosphere. So trying to just extract it from the background atmosphere is going to be a very intensive and therefore costly process. I was on a webinar with a group discussing carbon capture and storage recently, and in their estimation of getting from the rapid transition scenario to the sustainable development scenario, with all of the best will in the world and all of their pro-carbon capture positions, they had it as, I think it may even be the next slide, I'll just try and move on to it. Yeah, it's this one. They showed it as only being 9% of the emissions reductions globally. Now, 9% is still a big number and it's very worth having, but we do need to get there.
Okay, Nigel Quinion has come back and said, first of all, he's apologized. It was a slip of the, it was a mistype when he put RORE, he meant ROEI. He says the key takeaway is that bashing of renewable energy on the basis of ROEI is entirely unsupported. Not to say that I reject all of Richard's excellent presentation. He's right to highlight much of the unrealism of future trend forecasts. Well, thank you for that, Nigel, much appreciated. I have a question from P. Bren. Is the holy grail for the future of hydrocarbons to grow total annual hydrocarbon production, extract the energy economically without burning it, and reduce total global emissions to the 2050 Paris climate targets?
I'm not sure how you would extract the energy without burning it, no, I think the holy grail is to have a future in which we use less hydrocarbons, particularly as a source of energy. They are immensely complex and useful products. And I think future generations will look back and say, you know, what, you burnt them, really? It's a ridiculous thing to do with them in many ways. I think the holy grail is to have as many good alternatives as possible, partly just to diversify our supply of energy, because diversification provides a form of resilience, and partly because there's such valuable resources for things other than burning them.
Thank you. I've got here again from Lucy. I think we've probably dealt with this, Lucy Williams. Whose responsibility is it to encourage discussion around the message you're presenting today with policymakers, financiers, society, media? She doesn't hear where this message is. Well, I guess it's what we're trying to address, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and I think it's a difficult one because it's a message that a lot of people don't want to hear. It's much easier to go and tell people that the world's going to be absolutely fantastic and we're all going to be, there's going to be disruption and technology will save us. There's a much better market for that kind of discussion. You know, if you go into a leading bookseller, you will find acres of books about what the future is going to look like, but very, very few of them tell you that it's going to be, you're going to have to deal with a lifestyle that has less energy and is going to be more expensive. And I think part of that falls in, as a slide I didn't show today, but there's a sort of a feedback loop between media, public opinion, and policymakers. And the problem with media is that they're basically selling a product. In the old days, you were selling newspapers, and nowadays you're selling advertising space. You need to have clicks, or you need to have sales of newspapers or subscriptions. And to get that, you often use clickbait. So it's much easier to have stories that are hyperbolic than stories which are actually quite mundane. And I think it's very problematic that the stories don't get told. And actually that's part of the narrative of the book Factfulness by Hans Rosling, is that he starts off by asking 13 questions about the state of the world. And he's asked them to all sorts of illustrious groups of people, including world leaders at the UN, at Davos, and so on. And they're multiple choice questions. And if you were to select randomly, and he uses the example of chimpanzees picking numbers out of a hat, you would expect people to get at least 33% of these correct. Now, every question is asking about the state of the world. And in almost every case where he has done this, people score worse than chimpanzees. And he says the reason is that our biases and instincts are being triggered because it's much easier to write an article about how bad the world is, to trigger fear, to trigger urgency, than it is to write one that's balanced and tells people a boring story about actually how it might be okay. So, the media drives public opinion drives politics, and we don't get to hear alternative narratives very often. So,
what about financiers, though? I mean, she's included that in her question. What about financiers? Should they be doing more? Some of the realities?
Well, contrary to what people may think, financiers are people too. And you know, if you're working in a corporation, and it's true also of people leading large oil companies, if you have, how shall I put it? If you have your shareholders or your stakeholders telling the board that the company should be going in a certain direction, or the finance of a bank should be deployed in a certain direction, to keep your job, you will do that. The board will keep their job because the stakeholders can remove them. The management will do it because the board can remove them. And the question then is, how far back do you go? You know, you have the very large pension funds and you have the asset managers who have to deploy capital, and they are under pressure from their stakeholders who are, in the case of endowment funds, they can be the students you saw protesting in one of my slides. They can be pension groups. They have a mandate to follow this public opinion as well. So financiers do not act independently of public opinion.
Good. I got a great question here from Sylvester. I like this one a lot. Richard, absolutely fantastic talk. With regards to the bit on climate justice / injustice, what is your opinion? Most energy transition conversations are EU, UK, US centric, with little thought given to emerging economies in Africa, for example. What is your message toward these economies? Keep building refineries, keep exploring for oil in the Niger Delta, keep chasing cheap energy? Or is there some sort of happy medium that can be achieved? Cue nuclear in Liberia.
Yeah, for example. No, absolutely. I think it's a very pertinent point that so much of the discussion does focus on the EU, UK, US. And very often, you know, solutions are trying to be imposed on other countries and other regions. You know, I think you can see that's what's happened in Asia, is that to achieve the remarkable transformation that's happened in India and China, there has been an enormous reliance upon the cheaper forms of hydrocarbon, of coal, gas, and oil. I think it is, you know, it is very problematic for the world to try and dictate to Africa what they should or shouldn't use. And if you recall the image of the carbon emissions from Africa, I mean, if Africa doubled or possibly even tripled its carbon emissions, with perhaps the exception of South Africa, you know, it probably wouldn't make a great deal of difference. You could have far greater decreases by more sober lifestyles in the US, in the UK. That would be completely outweighed, but it would make a huge difference to the people living in what are called, you know, low levels of poverty. It doesn't require much energy to step up from the lowest level to the next level and to the third level. It's only when you get into the fourth level that you have this extreme affluence and vast energy use. So yeah, I think a happy medium will be achieved. I don't think it's going to be achieved by the West, if I can call it that, imposing energy choices on Africa. No.
Thank you. Julie Harold has asked a question that somebody in our meeting this morning asked. Have you been able to give this presentation to anyone in government?
No, not yet. Hoping to do so at some point. Both here and abroad. I'm a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, which gives me a very useful platform for talking at a administrative level in Canada. But yeah, I believe this is a question that should be addressed. And actually, I'm quite encouraged because I see in many places around the world that people like Jean-Marc Jancovici, who I mentioned earlier on in France, for example, he does have a very good access to political leaders. So I think there is a curiosity about this and a concern that perhaps the single focus approach to transitioning at any cost is certainly one that needs to be discussed at least.
Thank you. For one from Gabriel Perez, don't you think that as mankind faces the hardships coming from lack of cheap, high-density energy, resistance to nuclear will recede?
Yeah, I do. I think very much so. And I mentioned the sort of the cognitive dissonance that's going on in the environmental movement at the moment, because there are sections of that movement who would prioritize low carbon energy sources over the portion of the movement who have historically been very entrenched in being anti-nuclear. And I think that creates enormous problems because people basically have to change their minds, and nobody likes doing that. So yeah, and you know, there are some quite robust arguments that nuclear power is actually one of the safest forms of power. It's just that things like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, you know, they are very, very scary events, even if the reality of the damage they did is perhaps not as bad as the perception of it. For example, I believe that, you know, either nobody or just a very few people actually died directly from the Fukushima meltdown. Now, quite a lot of people died during the evacuation. 160,000 people were evacuated from the area, and I believe about 1,200 people died during that evacuation from stress and so on and so forth. But actually, as a direct consequence, very few. Now, that obviously isn't the whole story, because if they hadn't evacuated, then there would have been a very different outcome. But as whilst it was a terrifying event, you know, people are now back living and farming in the area. So we have a perception that nuclear is incredibly dangerous. It is very scary if things go wrong, but I think modern nuclear is advancing. But on that factor, I mean, another thing we should think about is that the cost of nuclear is going up, particularly in Europe. And one of the reasons for that is that the expertise that was built up over 50 or 60 years, because we haven't built any nuclear power stations in almost any country, in Germany or France or the UK, that expertise is a generational thing and it's gone. So it is actually now one of the causes of increasing costs in nuclear.
Yes. Talking of Fukushima, am I right or am I not that Guardian's George Monbiot decided that he thinks that perhaps nuclear has to be the solution?
I think he's one of the voices out there. The most vocal is a guy called Michael Schellenberg, who was at one point Environmental Activist of the Year. And he has, rather like Michael Moore with Planet of the Humans, you know, when I talk about these things, people are just going to say, well, you're just a lackey for the oil industry. Yes. When environmentalists or social justice campaigners talk about it, it's a lot more difficult to dismiss. And so he, you know, Michael Schellenberg has attracted the ire of a large section of the environmental movement, because he, you know, he will say nuclear, because it has such a small footprint, is in many ways less environmentally damaging. And, you know, he's looked at studies of the impact of solar farms in the Mojave Desert on indigenous species such as tortoises and so on. You know, and again, it comes back to the idea that there are trade-offs. You cannot optimize all parts of the energy trilemma at once.
The next question is from a chap called Vincent. He's addressing things that, to some extent, you've already touched on, but I'll read you it through. How do we bridge the gap between the developed world and the developing world when it comes to energy? Countries like Zimbabwe, he says, are still using a lot of fossil fuel energy as they try to develop and switch to more reusable resources. And he goes on to say, also with the great work being done by people like Leslie Dewan, I don't know the name, and many others in line with creating safer nuclear reactors and the reuse of waste material from nuclear energy to harness more energy, can we see the world pushing for a greater use of nuclear energy?
Well, I think on the latter point, I think we've just discussed that, and I think the answer is yes. There's also the technology of, you know, smaller scale nuclear reactors. I believe Rolls-Royce are working on that quite hard as well. In terms of energy balance, I think when we look at countries like Zimbabwe, I suspect the problem's not even that they use large amounts of hydrocarbons, because they don't. What they use is a large amount of biomass. And when we think about biomass, we often think of things like the Drax electricity plants in the UK, which burn wood pellets imported from the other side of the Atlantic, which I am a little bit skeptical about. But in countries like Zimbabwe, this is burning wood, charcoal, and animal dung. And that has implications for deforestation, and it has implications for indoor air pollution and human health. So there, I think, you know, we should be actively encouraging the switch to gas, for example, for cooking, and more broadly, you know, in terms of rebalancing things, in a perfect world, you would take something like the Human Happiness Index instead of the Human Development Index. And on that index, you can find that people do not get happier after a certain amount of energy. As you ramp up from being energy poor to moderately energy wealthy, people get happier because their lives get easier. But as you continue up the energy usage scale, people no longer get happier. There's a plateauing. And countries like the US, or particularly the US, uses vastly more energy per capita than anyone else in the world. So in a perfect world, what you would do is you would downscale those countries which are above the happiness index for energy use, and you would use that to upscale the energy use in those countries which are below that threshold.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question from Chris Pullen. I'm just going to come back to a couple of others later if we have time. But Chris Pullen asks, isn't our major hurdle the lack of available high energy density electricity storage?
I think that is a very big part of it. But I think you also then have to think about how the electricity will be generated. And I think this then becomes as much as a question about the cost of producing machinery and storage and so on. It's also about the availability of minerals and resources to do so. I saw a number the other day, and I apologize, I don't remember it exactly, but I think somebody said if we were to convert, the whole of the world's primary energy into wind power and ignore the fact that it is intermittent, you would need something like 800 million wind turbines, which would cover an area larger than the whole of the continental North America. It's something of that scale. In terms of battery storage, I tried to give an indication of just how much battery storage you would need. And battery storage is required because we want energy security. You have to be able to address these issues of these 10-year events, 40-year events, 100-year events. And in the UK, it was calculated by a team, I believe, associated with the Natural History Museum, that if you were to replace all of the UK's cars with batteries for electric vehicles, it would use up more than the entire annual production of a bunch of minerals like cobalt and other key minerals. So, that was just for the UK. When you try and scale that up to a global level, it's going to have an enormous impact. It doesn't mean to say it can't be done. For example, cobalt at the moment is mined in only a couple of places, but there is apparently a large amount of cobalt sitting in nodules on the seafloor. Well, it is there, but again, there's going to be an environmental trade-off if we start to access that. And I just think the scale of trying to do energy storage, electricity storage, when we factor into the fact we will need more electricity, is going to be just as huge. There are projects which have scale associated with them, and one fascinating one is a project that you'll find on the fringes of the internet about a huge pumped storage project in the Scottish Highlands, where you could build a gigantic dam, flood a very large part of the Highlands, build a canal that would be larger and more costly than the Panama Canal. But you would have essentially, with pumped storage, you essentially have a giant battery that's available very, very rapidly, and it would be able to power. I believe the calculation was something like Europe for the whole of Europe for 30 days in terms of their electricity needs. So there are some things out there, but none of them are going to be simple. None of them are going to be cheap.
Thank you. I want to tell people to stop asking questions because we're going way over time, but I'm going to try and. If you don't mind, we'll keep going for a bit and just deal with the most obvious ones, and then I may just refer to one or two, go back. So from Ellen, quite an interesting one. Some oil-producing countries are depleting their freshwater resources to inject into oil fields to increase recovery when they could be injecting CO2 as an alternative, were it more readily available. With freshwater reserves depleting and legislation placing a price on carbon, do you think there is the possibility that CO2 injection could take over from water injection?
From a petroleum engineering point of view, the effect of injecting CO2 into a reservoir for enhanced oil recovery is different from what you get from injecting water. There are certain cases where it can work very well. It can be better than injecting water. The problem's going to be location. It's having carbon dioxide being extracted from industry, transported to the sites where it can usefully be injected and potentially replace water. one of the things about injecting water into oil fields that we should remember is that the water has to be compatible with the water that's already existing in the subsurface, and the subsurface is full of water, and that water is saline, except for very shallow aquifers, which tend to be fresh water. Oil fields are almost always at depth. The water that you find is almost always saline, so you have to inject saline water. You don't inject fresh water into them because it would cause all sorts of problems of mineralization. So the conflation of fresh water and injection into oil fields is actually quite rare. I think that notion comes a little bit out of the fracking world, where you have to use water to inject. But that water is mostly pumped out and reused, because certainly in West Texas, you do have very serious limitations on water. In terms of injecting CO2 to enhance oil recovery, there are some very good works done on this in Canada. Cenovus is a leader in this technology. And there is a notion that in certain places you can produce carbon neutral hydrocarbons, because you inject more CO2 which stays in the ground than will be emitted from the hydrocarbons that are produced and consumed. But unfortunately, these are quite rare. And again, coming back to the question of policy, ideology, and dogma, a pipeline to take CO2 from sources where it can be captured to in fields where it can be injected has recently been quashed. So you can see that it looks like a fantastic idea, but politics can sometimes get in the way.
Thank you. I've got two more from P. Bren, whose brain is obviously hard at work. Would you endorse vast scaling of solar cooking to replace biomass in the developing and emerging markets? And separately, he's asked the question, appreciate your pointing out that we can't get to 2050 on current known producible oil and gas. Why aren't we seeing more in the industry speak out about this?
The second question first. I think that's because there is this perception up until very recently that the shale juggernaut was almost unstoppable. I saw a presentation, and I won't say which consulting company did it, but it was back in the end of 2018. And they were predicting that the US shale would get to 20 million barrels a day. And I questioned them on it. And I said, what do you mean it will get to 20? That's a sort of theoretical. And they said, no, we see absolutely no impediment, neither technological nor economic, for shale getting to 20 million barrels a day. And at the time, it was about 6. And I think even then it was pretty obvious that shale was not not a silver bullet to oil production. The Economist put it very beautifully. They said shale oil in the US requires three things. It requires sand for the fracking, beer for the roughnecks, and other people's money. And whilst you can throw other people's money at it, you will continue producing. And what we've seen now is that other people's money has gone away. And I think it's going to take time before this perception that we shouldn't be complacent about oil and our ability to produce it. It takes time for that change. And harking back to the comment from James Schlesinger about flipping between complacency and panic, what the markets will likely do is start panicking when this realization dawns on them. In an earlier presentation about 6 months ago, I was asked a question, and I sort of tongue-in-cheek suggested that to get people's attention back on the security of supply, maybe we should just turn the taps off for a couple of days. But of course, no one's going to do that, but I think it would really get people's attention very quickly. On the first question on solar cooking, I think it's a good idea, but one of the problems is that sometimes good ideas don't work in practice. And I've seen evidence of this in cases, for example, in East Africa, where you can find villages where they have solar equipment sort of littered around the village, which has been donated by well-meaning organizations. The solar equipment has broken, and there has been no backup and no technology to repair or replace. And there's a notion that adopting new technology can actually be a very slow process in some places. Now, clearly, that's not the case for mobile telephony and mobile banking in East Africa. There was extremely rapid adoption of that, so it's not a universal truth. but people will generally want to stick with what they know until something has been very clearly proven to be orders of magnitude better. So I think it's a good idea. I just don't think it's going to have scale.
Okay, with apologies to Thomas Myron, who's asked a question really about opening up the debate. With apologies to him, I'm not going to let you loose on that, Richard. There are two other questions which I think you can combine. So Julia Harold has asked another question and asked, what do you think the potential of tidal energy is in places where that's available? Never stops, but there are technological challenges, aren't there? And then similarly, Nigel Quinton has asked again, thoughts on green hydrogen. So tidal and green hydrogen, please.
On tidal, I like tidal because it's one of the few energies that doesn't come from, as an origin, it doesn't come from the sun. Almost everything else does. Solar power obviously does, wind power does, because winds are convection currents. Hydrocarbons are just fossilized sunlight. The sun is basically a large nuclear reactor, so everything comes there except from tidal, which is thanks to the moon and gravity. So it's quite a nice exception. There are areas where it's very dramatic. The Severn Estuary is a notable one, and there are projects to try and harness it. I just think in the big scheme of things, along with a lot of other sources of energy, it will be anecdotal as we move forward. Not to say it shouldn't be done. And the second question on green hydrogen, it's not an area I know a huge amount about. The principle, I think, is that you use electrolysis powered by renewable energy. The problem with that is then it's not really green if your renewable energy has built with 85% fossil fuels. And actually, I'm being a little bit generous there, because when you build wind turbines and solar plants, the vast amount of energy that goes into them, partly because of the sort of high energy physics that's required for creating concrete and steel and carbon fiber and so on, almost all of that is not going to be renewable electricity. It's going to come from coking coal and from other sources which deliver very, very high temperatures. So you can get green hydrocarbon if you have a wind turbine that is turning and does electrolysis and produce hydrogen. But I think there's again, it comes back to where do you put the boundary conditions on your levelized cost, on your energy return on energy invested, on your weighted average cost of energy. How far back do you go in the chain to decide when it was really carbon free? And the second point I'd make on it is that there's a lot of talk about, at the moment we see these huge capacity constraint payments being paid. I used Germany in an example earlier. We have them here in the UK as well. Electricity prices go negative, but the people who produce it still get paid the same amount. And taxpayers pay for the difference. So the obvious answer is, well, why don't you just hook that up to an electrolysis system and you create green hydrogen with the excess electricity? Well, the problem there is that unless that becomes mandated and we remove the capacity constraint payments, which is now happening in the next generation of renewable energy in the UK at least, there's no incentive economically to build a hydrogen electrolyzer that will only work occasionally when electricity prices are low or negative. And that's where you would need to build a dedicated solar or wind plant to do the electrolysis. And again, you then get into the thermodynamics and the cost structure that you're making more transformations than perhaps you really need. You're increasing the entropy, losing valuable energy on the way through, and it's getting more expensive.
Thank you. Listen, thank you, Richard. Thank you, audience, for your questions. We are going to stop there. We've run considerably over time, and you've been great, Richard, in answering all of these. Richard has agreed to circulate his contact details following this event. So if you would like to get into conversation with him, do please get in touch. At this point, normally, I would ask you to put your hands together and give some big applause for our speaker, which of course we can't do. Instead, I'm going to leave you with two requests. The first is, do join us, please, at future events. We have one we hope to present in September or October. when the Oil and Gas Authority and UK Oil and Gas will be making a new business case actually for continued investment in the oil and gas exploration production business on the UK continental shelf. And then in early 2021, we'll have another presentation on human-induced seismicity. Can we balance risk and reward, which of course is to do with fracking and dam building. And my second request, which I want to leave you with, is please give consideration to becoming a patron of the Geological Society of London. I'm not going to give you details of what this might cost or what you might get for it, but if you think that you or your organization could conceivably be interested to know more about our patron program, please contact the Society or email Jenny Boland on her jenny.boland@gilsoc.org.uk. Contact details will be in an email after this. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining the call, for listening, for your questions, and thank you once again, Richard, Dr. Richard Norris. Thank you. Good day to you all. Good evening, and goodbye.
Thank you.